South China Morning Post, 20th of September 2022. Unlike the pro-China Duterte, who China constantly manipulated, the President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., promotes U.S. investors. In effect, Filipino President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. reversed his predecessor Rodrigo Duterte's policy of separation from the global superpower and a pro-China stance that allowed China to bully the Philippines by saying that the future of his country is tied up with the United States as a partner. It was quite apparent to me in my vision for the way that the nation would go ahead that I cannot envision the Philippines in the future without having the United States as a partner, Marcos Jr. said after ringing the closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange on Monday. He encouraged U.S. investors to do so and described how they had benefited his nation, noting that many of the early economy's motors were essentially American firms. The United States was home to many of the country's most powerful corporate donors to the government and the rest of society in the Philippines. Only crime, Chinese triads, illegal gambling, and the takeover of the Philippines Islands were introduced by the Chinese. Such statements stand in sharp contrast to Duterte, who proclaimed the Philippines' separation from the U.S. early in his presidency on a visit to Beijing in 2016. Additionally, he vowed to sever a military alliance with the previous colonizer of his country but ultimately kept it after thanking the U.S. for the COVID-19 vaccine. Under Marcos Jr., the Philippines have intensified their objections against Beijing over a South China Sea territorial dispute. In an early show of balancing interests, Marcos declared China the country's strongest trade partner in pandemic recovery shortly after winning the May elections. As long as it was fair, he added, the administration would be willing to discuss oil drilling in the disputed territory with Beijing. Hoping to meet President Joseph Biden and other global leaders on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, Marcos Jr. stated during a speech on Monday to the Philippine American community in New Jersey. On the other hand, Marcos was scheduled to go on a state visit to Indonesia when Lu Jianchao, Minister of the International Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, IDPC, visited Manila for 3 days last month. Minister Lu told reporters we had no disagreements and no objections to regular state-to-state ties between the Philippines and the United States during his visit. We should be aware that their partnership journey is the longest. The travel to the U.S. by Marcos Jr. marks his third overseas journey since taking office in July and his first to the country since 1997. Following a peaceful rebellion supported by the populace, the Marcos family left Manila's Malacañang Palace in 1986. The family, including Marcos Jr., subsequently claimed that their dictator father, Marcos Sr., had wished to go to Pai in their native province of Ilocos Norte to wait out the revolution. Instead, they were transported by a U.S. military jet to Hawaii. As a result of his failure to abide by court orders on the distribution of the family's assets, the late dictator's son is now facing a $354 million punishment for contempt of court in the U.S. Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State for the United States, said in June that Marcos Jr. had diplomatic immunity and was thus permitted to visit the country. He mentioned new regulations in the Philippines that provide international investors extra benefits during his address at the New York Stock Exchange on Monday. First, he stated that we approved legislation to rationalize fiscal incentives and cut corporate income tax rates. The minimum paid-up capital requirements for international merchants and foreign startups introducing cutting-edge new technologies were also lowered. Third, firms that provide public services, including telecommunications, shipping, air carriers, railroads, subways, airports, and toll roads, are now completely open to foreign ownership. However, Marcos Jr. omitted to mention that previous President Duterte approved the laws. Despite being controlled by Marcos supporters, the current Philippine Congress has failed to pass any notable legislation. a 51.2% debt-to-GDP ratio, down from 62.1% when he took office on July 1, $99 billion in gross international reserves at the end of August, and upper-middle-income country status in 2 years were among Marcos' optimistic predictions for the Philippine economy by the time he leaves office in 2028. The actual situation, however, is somewhat different. He left his office of the president in disarray and dealing with several food shortages after taking a flight to New York to speak at the UN. Marcos designated himself the Agriculture Secretary to handle these problems, which immediately elevated him to the head of the Sugar Regulatory Administration, SRA. To safeguard the regional sugar industry, the SRA head chooses how much sugar may be imported. Victor Rodriguez, the president's senior advisor and executive secretary, resigned on Saturday, the day before he left for the U.S., after the president's senator friends looked into the dubious SRA order to import 300,000 metric tons of sugar, which Marcos had cancelled. The president was not consulted before issuing the transactions documents. 4 SRA employees who have since resigned claim they signed the import order after believing they had received encouraging signals from Rodriguez during the Senate investigation. He informed the senators that the directive had just been drafted, and only Marcos, the Secretary of Agriculture and consequently the head of the SRA, could sign it. However, when Rodriguez issued a memo authorizing Sebastian to represent Marcos in the SRA on July 15, which automatically made him, Sebastian, the SRA chair and gave him the power to sign import orders as well, Sebastian told senators that he assumed he had already been given the power to sign import orders. The Senate investigation recommended that corruption charges be brought against the 4 resigning officials, but strangely Rodriguez was not singled out for punishment. Rodriguez served as both Marcos' spokesperson and attorney during the election. America's principal ally is the Philippines. The experience with China under Duterte has made the duplicity of China taste unpleasant,